Suffering of women in Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the Nazis, was not only a place of death but also of inhuman experimentation. In its medical barracks, defenseless Jewish women were subjected to atrocious procedures in the name of science. Not only did Dr. Joseph Mengele carry out these experiments, other physicians, such as Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann, used prisoners as test subjects for their cruel studies. According to the account of Edith Eger, a survivor of this nefarious concentration camp, on a cold April morning, the Jews of Kassa in Hungary were arrested and confined in an old brick factory on the outskirts of the city. A few weeks later, Magda, my parents, and I were crammed into a livestock car destined for Auschwitz. That very day, my parents were murdered in the gas chambers. On my first night in Auschwitz, I was forced to dance for the SS commander Dr. Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, the man who that day controlled the line of the newly arrived and sentenced my mother to death. "Dance for me," he ordered. I stood there, terrified. I remembered my mother's advice: no one can take away what you have in your head. I closed my eyes and sought refuge in my inner world. In my mind, I was no longer confined in an extermination camp, frozen, hungry, and shattered by loss, but on the stage of an opera in Budapest, dancing the role of Juliet in a Tchaikovsky ballet. From that inner refuge, I forced my arms to rise and my legs to perform pirouettes. I had the strength to dance for my life. Every moment spent in Auschwitz was hell. Welcome to Frontline War Memoirs. In its early days, as has already been described, the Germans began to create concentration camps in Germany in 1933. In these camps, political opponents of the Nazi regime, persons considered undesirable elements, and Jews were imprisoned. After the outbreak of the Second World War, the Germans began to open concentration camps in other occupied countries. Auschwitz, like other Nazi concentration camps, was a state institution managed by the central authorities of the German state. It was directed directly by the Central Economic Administrative Office of the SS, Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt, WVHA, while the deportation of people to the camp and their extermination were the responsibility of the Reich Main Security Office, Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA. In January 1942, a conference was held in Wannsee that brought together representatives of the main services of the Reich. This conference developed a plan for the total extermination of the population, also known as the Final Solution. This event led to the construction of 6 extermination camps, in addition to the other forced labor camps that had been created earlier. Reinhard Heydrich, who convened the conference and was also head of the Reich Main Security Office, focused on the 11 million Jews whose genocide was being planned. At this meeting, it was discussed that the evacuation of Jews to Eastern Europe would replace the emigration project, with Hitler's prior agreement. This conference marked the moment when extermination became systematic, and the decision was made to install gas chambers in the camps, especially in Auschwitz. On the 30th of April of 1940, Rudolf Höss fulfilled an ambitious dream. At the age of 39, and after 6 years of service in the SS, he was appointed commander of one of the first concentration camps created by the Nazis in the new Reich. That spring day, he arrived to take up his post in a small town in the southwest of Poland, 18 months before it became part of Upper Silesia. It was called Oswiecim in Polish and Auschwitz in German. Despite this promotion, the concentration camp that Höss was to command did not yet exist. In fact, his first task was to supervise its construction from a series of dilapidated and insect-infested barracks belonging to the Polish army, clustered around a horse farm on the outskirts of the village. The surroundings could not have been more depressing. The land between the Sola and the Vistula was gloomy, with a damp and unhealthy climate. On that first day, no one, not even Höss himself, could have foreseen that in the span of 5 years, that camp would become the scene of the greatest massacre the world has ever witnessed. The history of the chain of decisions that led to this transformation is one of the most terrible known to humanity, and it gives us an exceptional insight into how the Nazi state functioned. Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, Hermann Göring, and other Nazi leaders made decisions that led to the extermination of more than 1 million people in Auschwitz. However, the mentality of lower-ranking leaders like Höss also played a key role in this crime. Without their qualities as leaders of men in the unknown field of repeated murder on such a colossal scale, Auschwitz could never have functioned as it did. The world has come to associate the German Nazi concentration camp Auschwitz with the symbol of the Holocaust, of genocide and of terror. It was created by the German occupying forces in the mid-1940 in the suburbs of Auschwitz, a Polish town that the Nazis incorporated into the Third Reich. Its name later became Auschwitz, which also became the name of the camp, Konzentrationslager Auschwitz. The immediate reason for creating the camp was the growing number of Poles detained by the German police, which led to overcrowded prisons. In principle, it was going to be just another concentration camp, created as part of the Nazi terror machinery active since the early 30s. This was, in fact, the function of the camp throughout its existence, even when, from 1942 onward, it began to become the largest center for the mass murder of Jews. The staff of KL Auschwitz was composed of members of the SS Schutzstaffeln. One of the most surprising functions of this camp, given the reality of what was happening there, was to provide the Nazis with a possible propagandistic alibi. In the early part of September 1943, 5,000 Jews were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau from Theresienstadt, located to the northwest of Prague. They were a unique case among the Jewish inmates because they were allowed to live in one of Birkenau's family camps. Although the men lived in barracks separate from those of the women, the children were not sent directly to the gas chambers. Instead, they could live with one of their parents. The Jews were told to write postcards to the relatives who remained confined in the Theresienstadt camp. The idea was that when the Red Cross personnel inspected Theresienstadt, they would believe, thanks to this ruse, that Birkenau was merely a labor camp. Several months later, when the Nazis had already used them for that purpose, almost all of the Jews from the family camp were murdered in the gas chambers. The women, mostly mothers, watched their children die in an act of barbarity never before seen. Another function of Auschwitz, which set it apart from Reinhardt's camps, was the increasing emphasis on medical experimentation. The most infamous of Auschwitz's physicians arrived at the center in the spring of 1943. The research conducted by Dr. Joseph Mengele in the fields of twins and dwarfs shocked the world when it became known just how far his cruelty had gone. For his work, he was assisted by several prisoners. Among them was the Pole Wilhelm Brasse, who had been sent to Auschwitz in 1940 as a political prisoner when he was 22 years old. In 1943, therefore, he was one of the inmates who had been in the camp the longest. By profession, he was a photographer, and it was precisely this experience that interested the German doctors at Auschwitz. Wilhelm recounted, "I spoke with Dr. Mengele. He explained to me that he would send me Jewish women, twins and triplets and all kinds of cases, and he wanted photographs to show the person in full, front, from the side, in profile, and from the back. Naked, therefore, these women were very embarrassed and intimidated. The girls were terribly intimidated. They were even afraid to speak to one another. In appearance, they were young girls just beginning to develop, in full growth. Mengele would take them off the trains." Some of the photographs that Wilhelm Brasse took were of horrifying images. For instance, there was the case of a young gypsy who was sent to him to be photographed. She had cancer on her face, and one could see her entire jaw. According to the photographer, you could see the bone, and Mengele explained to me that she had to be photographed in profile so that the bone would be clearly visible. Mengele was not the only doctor who conducted experiments in Auschwitz. In a medical building equipped with specific apparatus, for example, both Professor Karl Klauberg and Dr. Horst Schumann carried out studies on sterilization. Wilhelm Brasser, who took photographs for Mengele, also photographed anesthetized women who had been subjected to those sterilization experiments. The women had to sit in a special gynecological chair while the doctors stretched the vagina and extracted the uterus with forceps. Later, the photographer was informed that in many cases those operated women later died from a lethal injection. Karl Klauberg had been a professor of gynecology at the University of Königsberg and, like Mengele, was a staunch Nazi. Himmler had taken an interest in his work and had given his personal approval for him to use Auschwitz as a laboratory for human experimentation. As we have seen before, sterilization had always greatly interested the Reichsführer SS. In his experiments, Klauberg injected various substances into the women to prevent fertilization. The women suffered terrible pains and had high fevers, recounts Sylvia Vesela, a Slovak Jewish woman who assisted Klauberg. I took their temperatures, did X-rays and things like that. While Klauberg experimented with injections, his colleague Dr. Schumann administered enormous doses of radiation to his patients. Sylvia Vesela recalls that they were testing the effect of the intensity of X-rays on the small intestine. To say it was terrible is an understatement. These women were constantly vomiting. It was truly awful. Medical experiments on inmates were not exclusive to Auschwitz. Doctors from other concentration camps also participated. Shortly after the war began, several doctors in Sachsenhausen exposed inmates to mustard gas to measure the effect of the poison. Some of the most nefarious experiments were carried out in Dachau under the supervision of Dr. Sigmund Rascher. In 1942, prisoners were locked in sealed chambers to determine how much pressure their bodies could withstand. Other inmates were thrown into icy water to assess how long crews could survive if, when shot down, they fell into freezing seas. For the Luftwaffe, these experiments could be very valuable, of course. But in the German air forces, not everyone was pleased with conducting deadly experiments on human beings. When, in October 1942, Dr. Rascher presented his findings to prominent figures from the Ministry of Aviation, he found that there was a certain unease among the audience. Just before the meeting, Himmler had stated his position in a letter sent to Dr. Rascher. I believe that those who object to these human experiments even in our days, who would prefer that German soldiers die from the effects of that hypothermia, are guilty of high treason, and I will not hesitate to mention the names of those gentlemen to the appropriate authorities. In fact, there is evidence that Himmler attempted to secure Hitler's approval for these studies, and Hitler declared that, in principle, as far as the welfare of the state is concerned, human experimentation must be tolerated. In Dachau and Sachsenhausen, many of the prisoners chosen for the torture involved in medical experimentation were not Jews. But this is not surprising given that in 1943, the early part of 1943, there were fewer than 400 Jews in the Reich concentration camps that had been built before the war. Even in Auschwitz, as we have seen, Dr. Mengele selected for death equally the Sinti and Roma as he did the Jews. For someone like Mengele, Nazi ideology justified an entire series of murderous projects, from the extermination of the Jews to deadly medical experiments. All of it was part of a world in which medical professionals were the arbiters of life and death within the racial state. On the other hand, for Oskar Groening, from the SS detachment in Auschwitz, what was happening in the camp made at least a certain amount of sense. In 1943, when he was 22 years old, he worked in the camp's economic department, counting the money stolen from the Jews who arrived at the facility. He was a die-hard nationalist who firmly believed in the key principles of Nazism. We were convinced, because that was our view of the world, that there was a great conspiracy of Judaism against us, and that idea was reflected in Auschwitz. It had to be prevented. It had to avoid what had already happened in the First World War, namely that the Jews would bring us down. We are killing the enemies within Germany. If necessary, they are exterminated. And between these two battles, the battle on the war front and the national front, there is not the slightest difference. So we were simply exterminating enemies. It is one thing to credit this theory, and quite another, however, to witness collective killings in practice. Generally, Oscar Groening could avoid the horror because most of his working hours were spent in an office. But when he saw the bloody reality of the massacres, he was shocked. Once in Birkenau, he encountered corpses being incinerated in the open air. The flames rose, sparking, and the capo later recounted details of the pyre. It was terribly unpleasant, horrendous. He mocked the fact that when the bodies began to burn, they obviously generated gases in the lungs or other parts, and the corpses seemed to jump, and the male genital organs would suddenly become erect in a way that made him laugh. On the other hand, in the early part of 1944, Ida Greenspan, upon arriving at Auschwitz, recounted that her willpower allowed her to withstand the hardships. One had to adapt to that way of life. Do you understand what I mean? One had to adapt to sleeping in such conditions, to working very hard, to spending hour after hour receiving orders with insufficient clothing. Yes, when the mindset is there, the body adapts. If you are not mentally there, your body will not follow. That is why young people fared much better than those who were 35 or 40 years old. 40 was the maximum. The will to survive was stronger in us, in the young. However, until the beginning of the war, the number of Jews in the concentration camps was small, and they were normally incarcerated, mostly for political reasons. The first great wave of Jewish detention occurred, as we have already mentioned in previous videos, in 1938 after the Night of the Broken Glass. But practically until 1941, Nazi policy regarding the Jews consisted above all of expelling them from the space dominated by the Great German Reich. Until 1938, the objective with the German Jews was to make their lives so unbearable that emigrating became the only possible solution. The policy was successful, since nearly 500,000 German Jews, half of them, left Germany, especially when the Nuremberg laws were applied in 1935, which in practice nullified their status as German citizens. One of those laws, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, which prohibited marriages and extramarital relations between Jews and subjects of the state of German blood, reflects the Nazi racial vision and lays the foundation for their later policy. At the peak of its operation, the Auschwitz camp consisted of three main parts. The first and oldest was Auschwitz I, called Stammlager. The number of prisoners ranged from 12 to 20,000, built in the mid-1940 on the grounds and in the buildings of an old Polish garrison, and which was progressively expanded to meet the needs of the camp. The second part was the Auschwitz II Birkenau camp. In 1944, it reached 90,000 prisoners, the largest within the Auschwitz camp complex. Its construction began in the autumn of 1941 on a plot of land 3 kilometers from Auschwitz in the village of Brzezinka, from which the Polish population was expelled by demolishing their houses. In Birkenau, the largest facilities for mass extermination in occupied Europe were erected, the gas chambers where the Nazis murdered the majority of the Jews deported to the camp. The third part was the Auschwitz III Monowitz camp, also called Buna. In the summer of 1944, it housed 11,000 prisoners. Initially, it was one of the sub-camps of Auschwitz that was built in 1942 in Monowitz, 6 kilometers from Auschwitz, alongside the synthetic rubber and gasoline workshops known as Buna Werke, constructed during the war by the German consortium IG Farbe Industry. In November of 1944, the Buna subcamp gained autonomy and was designated KL Monowitz. The majority of the Auschwitz subcamps eventually came under its administration. The Germans isolated all the camps and subcamps of the Auschwitz complex from the outside world and surrounded them with towers and barbed wire fences. Any contact between the prisoners and the outside world was strictly forbidden. However, the area managed by the commander and controlled by the SS personnel of KL Auschwitz extended beyond the barbed wire fenced perimeter. It covered approximately another 40 square kilometers, the so-called Interessengebiet, area of interest. stretching around Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II-Birkenau. In addition, dozens of subcamps, some of which were situated at a considerable distance from the main camp, were subject to Auschwitz's administration. The first instance of mass murder in a gas chamber took place in Auschwitz in September of 1941 with Soviet prisoners of war. But the Germans had already tested the use of gas since 1939 on lives that were not worth living as part of their T4 program, the euthanasia program, causing the death of approximately 5,000 children and more than 70,000 adults, both men and women, including the disabled and the mentally ill in Germany. Indeed, it was at the beginning of the war when Hitler signed an order, dated the 1st of September of 1939, that allowed his chancellery chief, Philipp Buhler, and his personal physician, Karl Brandt, to grant a merciful death to those incurably ill. The true mastermind behind this psychiatric Holocaust was, however, Victor Brack. The T4 program took place officially as a public health policy between 1939 and 1941, at which point it was closed due to protests from the Catholic and Protestant churches. Nevertheless, under other names and in other forms, the extermination of people considered a burden on society would continue until the end of the war. Jointly administered by the SS, the police, and the medical personnel, the T4 program was the conceptual, technical, and administrative precursor to the final solution, which was implemented in the extermination camps, causing the death of almost 3 million people between 1942 and 1944. With the exception of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where a selection was made among the new arrivals to send the fittest to the local factories, in these camps no selection was made between those destined to die immediately and those who were capable of working. Only small groups, composed mainly of Jews, were temporarily kept alive to carry out some of the most sordid tasks of the death machinery, helping the condemned to strip and enter the gas chambers, storing their clothes and belongings, removing the corpses and cleaning the gas chambers, burying them, and then burning or incinerating them. These groups, known as Sonderkommando, Special Command, were subjected to a regime of constant terror and were periodically murdered as witnesses to an unprecedented crime. Majdanek and Auschwitz, originally built as concentration camps, expanded into extermination camps. Birkenau, Auschwitz II, was the center of extermination, and its subcamps functioned as forced labor camps. More than 1 million Jews and tens of thousands of gypsies and Soviet prisoners of war were murdered there between March of 1942 and November of 1942 and 44 by means of the gas Zyklon B. The mass extermination began in March of 1942, and its 4 large gas chambers had the capacity to kill 12,000 people per day. The corpses were then burned in adjacent crematory ovens. On the other hand, from the Nazi point of view, life in the camps was a microcosm of the outside world. The idea of struggle is as old as life itself, Hitler said in a speech in 1928. He added, "In that struggle, the strongest, the most capable, wins, while the less capable, the weak, loses. Combat is the father of all things. It is not by the principles of humanity that man lives or is capable of sustaining himself beyond the animal world, but only through the most brutal of struggles." Thus, upon their arrival at the camps, the prisoners were confronted with a world radically opposed to the one they had known before the war. Human life had no value, and dehumanization was a mechanism methodically set in motion. Stripped of their names, hair, and clothes, the prisoners became nothing more than a number. Every morning before work and every evening upon returning, they were subjected to a roll call with an endless signal, during which they had to remain standing in line and in silence while their numbers were called out. If someone was missing, they were forced to wait for endless hours in the snow, in the rain, or under an unrelenting sun, hungry, thirsty, and exhausted, until the reason was explained. Suffering was a constant, as were the abuses. Beatings and whippings, which could end in death, were part of the daily routine. even a trivial transgression of the rules, or simply because the guards or capos felt like it, was enough. Their impunity allowing the release of the most irrational instincts. The deportees slept huddled together on wooden planks serving as beds, which sometimes might include some straw infected with lice and a filthy blanket. The latrines were insufficient and repulsive, with an indescribable stench aggravated by the constant diarrhea caused by endemic dysentery. On the other hand, the SS units also acted as personnel in the concentration camps. The SS served as the management and surveillance authorities of the camps, and they also participated in the mass extermination of Jews and in the executions. Only Germans could be members of the SS. Later, the so-called Volksdeutsche, that is, citizens of other states with proof of German ancestry who had signed the Volkslist, were recruited. Throughout the existence of KL Auschwitz, more than 8,000 SS supervisors passed through the camp. In 1942, the camp assumed a second function. It became the center of extermination for European Jews. The only reason they died was because they were Jews, regardless of their age, gender, profession, citizenship, or political convictions. After the selection, the majority of the new arrivals classified by the SS doctors as unfit for work were murdered in the gas chambers. Among them were the sick, the elderly, pregnant women, and children. These were never registered in the camp, as they were never assigned a number. To conclude this analysis, on the 27th of January of 1945, Soviet troops liberated the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. Until then, the world had not believed the scarce accounts of survivors who had managed to escape the Nazi horror. The Allies, preoccupied with combating the German invasion of Europe, reacted passively to rumors of attempts to exterminate Jews in the German concentration camps. No one could have imagined that the little-known city of Auschwitz in southern Poland would go down in history as the setting for atrocities, murders and tortures suffered by Jews, Gypsies, black people, the disabled political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals and Polish intellectuals. With its liberation, it became clear how silently the Third Reich had established an elimination machinery over occupied Europe and over the feeling of Aryan racial superiority. Up to 1 million Jews were gassed in the gas chambers of Birkenau, a second concentration camp built in 1943 to expand Auschwitz I. On the very day of its inauguration, 8,000 Krakow Jews were gassed and subsequently incinerated. Auschwitz reeked of burning flesh, and the ashes emanating from the crematories were the only testimony that Hitler's government left as a memorial of the population it intended to exterminate. Everything occurred in silence, so as to avoid resistance and the interruption of the trains carrying the massive deportations of European Jews. Auschwitz became the center of the Holocaust. Since then, society, the world of politics and culture have questioned how something so horrifying, so tremendously cruel, could occur in a cultured and civilized country. It is inconceivable how members of the SS could play target practice with the children who tried to escape from the camp's electrified fences. This still shocks us, because we still cannot believe what could have happened for such events to occur, and especially out of respect for the thousands of people who suffered in the Holocaust. Subsequent to these atrocious events, between the months of September and November of 1945, the Bergen-Belsen trial took place in the city of Lüneburg, Germany, in which 45 SS agents and capos were tried for war crimes committed during the Second World War in the extermination and concentration camps of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. After 2 arduous months, during which dozens of survivors testified both orally and in writing, 31 of the accused were found guilty. Among this group were figures such as Josef Kramer, SS officer and commander in the Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen camps, Irma Gräser, supervising guard in both, Franz Hössler, SS officer and head of the preventive detention camp in both camps, Fritz Klein, physician and SS officer, and Johanna Bormann, prison guard in both camps, who together with 6 other defendants were condemned to the death penalty. The peculiarities of this trial lie, on the one hand, in that it was the first carried out by the Allies for Nazi war crimes. On the other hand, the aforementioned accused, despite having been captured after the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen camp by British forces in April of 1945-45, were tried both for their actions in that camp between 1944 and 1945, and for their previous crimes in Auschwitz. Undoubtedly, Auschwitz is considered today the ultimate symbol of the Holocaust and of Hitler's genocidal policy, especially from 1942 onward, when it became the epicenter of Nazism's crimes against women, a unique place in which the largest deportation camp within the Nazi concentration universe and the greatest extermination center in the history of the Third Reich were combined. For all these reasons, Auschwitz has become synonymous with absolute evil. As mentioned earlier, it was there that the first instance of mass murder in a gas chamber took place in September of 1941 with Soviet prisoners of war. It was there that Jewish and Gypsy women served as guinea pigs for the diabolical experiments carried out by Nazi doctors and nurses. More than 1 million human beings from 15 European countries were gassed, and more than 200,000 men, women, and children died from hunger, cold, disease, exhaustion, and brutality, or simply from loneliness and absolute despair. Furthermore, the Nazis also felt enormous disdain for the Poles. In a document sent to Hitler in May of 1940, Himmler stated that their destiny was to be a people of uneducated slaves. The non-German population of the Eastern Territories should not receive an education beyond that of primary school. The aim of primary school will be only to teach simple arithmetic, such as counting up to 500 at most, writing one's name, and learning that it is the will of God to obey the Germans, to be honest, hard-working, and to behave well. I consider it unnecessary for them to learn to read. In that document, which reflects with sinister clarity the Nazi racial ideology, Himmler goes further. One must separate those who have valuable blood from those whose blood is useless. Thus, families were torn apart, and Polish children between 6 and 10 years of age, whose blood was considered racially acceptable, were sent to Germany to be educated far from their biological parents. The personal and familial drama of those children did not concern Himmler. It fit perfectly within the Nazi doctrine that classified and ranked human beings based on their race and blood. Perhaps the most degrading aspect for the prisoner population in these camps was the forced use of the victims as their own executioners. Thus, in the camps exclusively dedicated to extermination, a mere handful of SS was enough to achieve the objective. It was the prisoners themselves who were compelled to ensure the functioning of the death machinery.